This is lecture number 2 for History 321, the French Revolution, for Tuesday, April 28th. We're going to get into the French Revolution in a little bit in the next lecture. We're not going to talk about the French Revolution right now much. But I want to talk about, I talked last time about the fact that we're going to be using theory to shape our understanding of the French Revolution. And so I want to talk about two of the main theories, and these are ones that are often kind of hard to grasp, and they're kind of hard to apply to real history. So I really want to talk about them just on their own as theories for right now. And because of that, I'm going to start with Marxism, and I'm going to move on to post-structuralism, because these are the two theories that are the hardest to sort of understand. We're going to have a different theory later called what I call contingency theory, which is basically Tackett and Andrus. But that one's fairly easy to grasp. That one's sort of intuitive, and people don't have much trouble grasping that one. So these two are the hard ones. So you might want to come back to this later, this lecture at various points later in the course, and just look at this again, because it'll start to make more sense as we go through the course. So I want to start then with Marxism. Karl Marx lived in the 19th century. He died in the 1880s, and he was initially a philosopher. And he studied all these ways that ideas shaped history, but then he realized that a lot of the philosophy he had studied really he thought was backwards, or as he put it, he found the philosopher Hegel standing on his head, and he put him right side up. So what Marx did instead of saying ideas determine everything, is Marx said, no, ideas don't determine everything. The physical world determines everything about human beings. What we're really doing is just, we're living in the physical world. And in particular, what Marx said is that if you look at a society, every society has an economy through which they produce food, clothing, housing, consumer goods, whatever, right? And you know, some societies are better at it than others, but every society has a system for producing that stuff. And what I mean by a system is that every society decides that certain people get control of certain things, like factories or fields or mines or forests, and other people work on those things, and then they have a decision about who gets to keep the money that's generated by that. And so Marx says that Marx says that's really the foundation of every society is you have a bunch of stuff, what he calls the mode of production, or the means of production, rather. You have the means of production, which is all the factories and the forests and the mines and the animals and the agricultural land, anything that can create value or produce something that human beings can use. That's the means of production, right? But then Marx says you have to organize. How are you going to use those means to produce stuff? And Marx says that you could then have, every society has its own mode of production, its own way of organizing the economy. Some societies have slaves who have to work, and then slave owners, and some societies have wage laborers and factory owners. Some societies, the government controls everything, and some societies, private individuals own things. There's all sorts of ways you can organize a society, and that's called the mode of production. But what Marx says, then, is that the way a society is organized, the mode of production, who owns what, who controls what, who has to work, who doesn't have to work, who's wealthy, who's poor, that shapes everything else about the society. Okay, and that's what we mean by materialist determinism, which is Marx's idea, that the way you organize the material society, who owns the mines, who works in the mines, who owns the factories, who works in the factories, etc., that determines everything else about a society. The culture, the way people think about things, the religion, all that. So Marx argues that basically the way you organize the economy shapes everything else about a society. And Marx says then, if you look at any particular society, what you're going to see is that they've organized it a certain way, and there's always going to be one group of people who own stuff. They control, they make the decisions about what's going to be made and who's going to work where. And then there's a big chunk of the society who doesn't control things, they have to work. Okay? And so I'm going to use the term, Marx doesn't use this, the haves and the have-nots. The haves own everything, and the have-nots don't own anything, so they have to work. And Marx argues that this is there's lots of ways you can decide who's a have and who's a have not. Lots of things you can call them. You can call them aristocrats, or you can call them factory owners, or corporate board members, or whatever, or slave owners, whatever. But it always boils down, Marx says, to this, that the people who control the means of production, the physical stuff, the mines, the factories, the agricultural land, those people get to determine everything about a society. And the people who don't own things, the slaves, the factory workers, the peasants, they just have to work. And Marx says that this system is set up so that the haves, the people who own things, can take the work of the people who work and turn it into their own personal wealth. So the factory owner makes the factory workers work for wages, but the factory workers are creating a whole lot more wealth than just their wages. The factory owner takes all the extra wealth. The slave works for nothing, and all the wealth the slave generates goes to the slave owner. Right? And so Marx says there are lots of ways you can organize a society, but it all boils down to you have one group that owns things and one group that works because they don't own anything. Okay, so Marx says, well, what does this mean about a society or history in general? Well, Marx says the way you organize the economy, the mode of production, is what Marx calls the base. That's the foundation of society. If you're going to have slavery, then you have a slave society, and that shapes everything else. If you have feudalism with peasants and aristocrats, you have a feudal society, and that shapes everything else. If you have a capitalist society with capitalist business owner, corporate owners, and workers, wage workers, that shapes everything else. Right? So Marx basically says, you look at the economy of a society. How do they produce what they produce? And that's the base of society. Right? That shapes everything else. And everything else in a society, the religion, the culture, the TV shows, the books, the clothing styles, the way they live in their houses, everything, the architecture, everything about a society besides the economy is built on that foundation of the economy. So the way the economy distributes things shapes how the religion works out, what the educational system looks like, what the healthcare system looks like. It shapes everything else. So Marx says it's sort of like the economy is the foundation of society, and all the other parts of society, education, literature, arts, religion, etc., are a superstructure. They're the house that's built on top of that foundation, but the foundation shapes what the house looks like. Okay? So when Marx says, let's look at history, he basically says the first thing you want to look at, if you're studying history, the first thing you want to look at is how is the economy organized? Who is wealthy? Who owns the means of production? And then how do they make everybody else work and generate wealth for them? Right? So that's the basic question. Once you know that, Marx says, then the rest of it is simply the effects of the way the economy is organized. So if you want to understand the religion, the first thing you got to do is understand the economy and how the economy is organized, and then that will tell you why the religion does what it does. And if you want to understand the education system, if you first look at the economy, how the economy is organized, who's in charge of it, and then you see what the education system is for. If you want to understand fashion or literature or anything about a society, look at the economy first, and then you'll understand how the rest of it is produced. And in particular, this is kind of interesting, Marx argues that in every particular society, what happens is that the haves, the people who have all the wealth and control the means of production, they're rich, right? The slave owners in a slave society, or the aristocrats in feudal society, or the factory owners and corporate heads in a capitalist society. Those people, Marx says, have the power to shape everything else in society. So if in our capitalist society, the wealthy factory owners and the big hedge fund owners and the people with all the money want something out of government, they simply buy a bunch of politicians, and those politicians vote laws that do what the wealthy want. But if poor people want the government to do something, they don't have much chance to make that happen, according to Marx. Okay? And so basically what Marx is saying is that the rich people can shape the government and government policy. And in particular, Marx says, one of the things that rich people do is they make sure that government is going to protect their wealth. So governments always have laws against theft or against anything like that that would take wealth away, allow poor people to get wealth from rich people. And the government also makes laws that allow rich people to take more wealth from poor people. right? It has wage laws and contract laws and things like that that allow the wealthy to take things away from poor people and put it in the pockets of the rich. That's Marx's interpretation there. And it goes beyond that. Marx says that if the wealthy in a society, they want to convince, they know they're screwing over the poor, the have-nots. They know they're taking wealth from the workers and they're putting it in their own pockets, but they need to if they know the workers outnumber them, right? And so the wealthy then try to find all sorts of ways to make sure that the poor can't take the wealth away from the rich. So I just said they have government passed laws about theft and contract laws and things like that to protect the wealthy. But then they have the government set up police to stop people from stealing things and to catch anybody who does try to steal things. And they set up an army to protect their stuff from outside invaders. And the government also, well, the rich find that using force, police and the army and stuff is expensive. Right? And it doesn't always work because there's a lot of workers and not that many police or army. So what the rich also do is they try to shape the education system and the religion and all sorts of other things in society to reinforce the idea that the rich are supposed to be rich, that they're there for a reason. And so what Marx says is that a lot of culture is simply the haves coming up with ideas for why this system where the haves are rich and everybody else is poor is the best system and you shouldn't question it. Don't try to change it, right? And so if it's a slave society, they try to come up with ideas for why slavery is bad and slaves are bad and they deserve to be slaves and the slave owners are good and they deserve to be slave owners. And you might do things like, maybe if you're running a slave society, you don't want the slaves to be able to read because they might start to realize that slavery is bad, so you don't teach the slaves to read. The education system does not teach slaves. It only teaches the upper classes how to read, so they have this enormous advantage. Or maybe you have the education system teach that slaves have lower intelligence or slaves are more animalistic or something to try to justify why slavery is the way it should be. And then maybe you also, the education system might do that. Or the education system might push the idea in the Middle Ages. It might push the idea that God chose aristocrats to be in charge because God has an order for society. He wants it this way. So don't question why aristocrats have all the money and power because God wanted it that way, right? You can also, as I just wandered into, you also can do this with religion, right? That you can have the religion say society is the way it is because God wants it that way, right? And so Marx says, many religions are like this. They are built by the wealthy to justify why the wealthy are wealthy because God wants it that way. So aristocrats, as I just mentioned in the Middle Ages, they get the Catholic Church to say God has an order for society and it includes aristocrats at the top and peasants at the bottom, and you don't question that because God said not to question it. Or Marx would say, Hinduism, for instance, has this caste system where there's this cosmic order and people are assigned to a caste based on their previous life, and they shouldn't question where they are in the caste system. They shouldn't question the caste system because that's bad karma and that'll bring you back in a worse life next time. So the religion says don't question things, right? And so Marx says this is a very normal thing. The haves, with their money and influence in society, make sure that the religion reinforces the way society is. Don't question society. God wants it this way, right? And so what Marx is saying then is that once the wealthy control the means of production, and they have all the money in society, they can shape everything else in society. They can make the government the way they want it to preserve their wealth and protect them. They can make the education system tell the workers that they should be doing it this way and that they should always live that way. They can have the religion saying God wants it to be this way. And everything else, Marx says, everything from architecture, if you look at a society and what's the biggest, most amazing buildings they build, it always represents the interest of the upper classes. That's why if you look at the Middle Ages, the two most powerful classes in society were the hierarchy of the church, the Catholic Church, and the aristocracy. And what are the glorious buildings of the Middle Ages? Cathedrals and castles, right, which represent the ruling class. You go to our society today, What are our most amazing buildings? Well, they're skyscrapers. Well, who owns a skyscraper? Big corporations, right? Every skyscraper has a big corporation's name on it. So they're basically, Marx says, they're sort of symbols of the power of the corporation. Don't question the corporation. Look, they built such amazing buildings. They're so big and powerful and rich. Don't even question them, right? So Marx argues that in every society, the haves, the economic structure sets up two classes. You have the haves and the have-nots, right? Roughly speaking. And everything else in society, and the haves economically set up a system that allows them to take all the wealth that's generated by the have-nots and put it in their own pockets, and so they get richer and richer. And Marx argues that every society then, everything else in society, from religion to education to laws to government, to culture to literature, reinforces the idea that the rich are supposed to be rich and you should not question this system. Right? So given that, Marx says if you look at all of human history, you can see this process of the haves and the have-nots, the base and the superstructure, playing out over and over again. He says and Marx has a really simplified vision of history. He says, if you look at human beings, when human beings started, they were hunters and gatherers, right? They lived in small groups and they moved around in the wilderness, and they lived off the land through hunting and gathering and all that. They didn't do agriculture. And Marx said they didn't have any form of private property, right? Because you're moving all the time. Your private property is whatever you can carry on your person. So there's no concept of owning land or owning a mine or owning a forest. People just moved around, right? And so Marx calls this primitive communism. There's no private property, so it's communism, but it's primitive because there's no real development of society here, right? But Marx says, and here he's following Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Marx says that the first second somebody invented the idea of owning land, private property, that changed everything, right? That fundamentally changed all society, because now, once you have private property, that means some people own more property and some people own less property. Right? Before, when nobody owned anything, everybody could just go around and eat whatever they wanted, take whatever they wanted, so everybody sort of owned everything. But now that you have private property, you say, no, this is my land, you can't have it. This is my forest, you can't have it. And so you've invented the idea that some people have things and some people don't have things. You've created the haves and the have-nots. But, okay, so now you've got the rich who own land, right? This is a new mode of production. Now you've got private property. That changes everything. But Marx says the rich very quickly realize, and here again he's using Rousseau, that private property has two problems with it. One is you have to get everybody to agree, or to put it slightly differently, somebody can take your private property. So you have to get everyone to agree that it's yours. Right? Especially if it's land. You can't run around chasing everybody off of your land, especially if you own a lot of it. So you have to have a system to get everybody to agree it's your land. And so Marx says what people do then is to protect private property, you create a government and you create laws to say this belongs to this person, that belongs to that person, and the government will enforce that. If you try to take something that doesn't belong to you, we're going to come and punish you for it. So now you've got government, right? Once you got private property, then you have government to protect private property. Right? But the second problem with private property is, suppose you own a lot of land, that's great, but it really doesn't matter if you don't have anybody who can turn it into something you can sell, right? A forest is great, but unless you have people to cut down the trees and turn them into lumber and sell it, it's not worth much. And owning land is great, but unless you have somebody who can plow it and seed it and harvest it and sell that grain, it's not worth much, right? So you need to have workers. Once you've got private property, one person can't work a lot of private property, so the property only means something if you get somebody to work on it. And so Marx says the initial way that people fixed this was, he said, early societies, ancient societies, had slavery. You would say, I can own another person and I can force them to work on the land. And Marx says, so you look at the ancient Roman Empire, or you look at ancient Sumeria or whatever, they've got slavery. Right? So slavery is their answer to how do we get people to work on our land. So the haves decide they need someone to work on their land. They need the have-nots to work for them. How do you get them to do that? Slavery. You force them to work. Physically force them. But Marx says slavery is not a great system. in part because it's not very efficient. Slaves have no incentive to work hard, right? If you work harder, you don't get anything, there's nothing better about it, so why would you work hard? You work slow. So Marx says that slavery worked for a while, but eventually the Roman Empire collapsed. And in particular, Marx said what happens usually is that change happens in history when the economy starts to change, right? So if you want to understand why something's changing in history, if you want to understand why did this change, why did this empire collapse, the answer is something is changing in the economy, because the economy is the base, it shapes everything else. So changing the economy is the only thing, Marx says, that can cause massive change in society. So what usually happens, Marx says, is that the economic system starts to function badly, and a group of the have-nots somehow figure out a new way to run an economy, and they get just enough wealth and power that they overthrow the haves. And so you get the Germanic tribes coming into the Roman Empire, and they overthrow the Roman Empire. They destroy the Roman system, right? Or, you can point to any revolution in the ancient world and say, usually it's some group of people who used to be have-nots staging a coup, overthrowing a government, and making themselves the haves. But Marx says real change only comes if the economy changes. And so when you have a revolution, when the Roman Empire collapses, you're going to get a different economic system on the other side of it, because the economic system had to be changing for the Roman Empire to collapse. So now you have a new stage in history, and you have a new economy, a new mode of production. What you have, Marx says, he's simplifying dramatically here, is you have feudalism. They come up with a new way to run the economy. Now, instead of having Roman patricians who have a whole bunch of slaves working on their land, now the feudalism is a better system because it gives the workers an incentive, a reason to work. And so feudalism, you carve up, the aristocrats own the land, and they hand out little parcels of land to peasants, and they say to the peasants, you get to work on this land, but I get half or 30% or 70% or whatever the percentage is for that piece of land. I get a piece of what you produce. So the more you produce, the more you get, but also the more I get. So this is a much better system, because now the peasants, instead of being slaves with no incentive to work, now know that if they work harder, they get more. But the aristocrat also gets more. Right? So this new system of feudalism, you tie a peasant to a piece of land and you tell them they get part of the proceeds. This gives them an incentive to work. Great. Well, feudalism works for a long time, right? And everything about the Middle Ages supports feudalism, right? The religion supports feudalism, and the peasants are told God wants the aristocrats to be in charge, and the education system only trains the upper classes, and et cetera, et cetera. The laws all protect aristocratic privileges, and the law protects the aristocrats' right to take the peasants' harvest, or half of it, or 2/3 of it, or whatever. So the first stage of history was primitive communism, where there was no private property. The second stage was the slave economy, where there's private property, but the only way they can figure out to make people work is slavery. That doesn't work very well. The third stage of history then is feudalism, where you have aristocrats and peasants, and the peasants have an incentive to work because they get part of the harvest, but they don't get much of the harvest. Well, the next stage, Marx says, the fourth stage, is capitalism. And Marx says basically what happens is that in the feudal system in the Middle Ages, you start to see this one group of the have-nots, people who aren't aristocrats, don't own land. They start to trade, and they start to make money through trade, and they start to get really rich trading. And you see the ships and sailing to India and the Americas and Columbus and Vasco da Gama, etc., and all that. European merchants who don't own land start to make money, and they start to realize that they might have enough power to overthrow the system, and so they overthrow the system, and they create a new system. And the new one is based on factories, and it's based on producing goods. It's not based on land so much. And they need a new way to organize the economy to get workers to work in factories, right? Because on a piece of land, you can say you keep half of the harvest, but what do you do with a factory, right? You get half of the shoes? No, that doesn't work. So they come up with a new system, which is that they will pay workers a wage, and then to produce things, they'll pay them a flat rate for their work, But what the workers are doing produces more wealth than that, and the factory owner pockets the wealth, the extra, right? And so this new system is called capitalism. And Marx says that's the system we're in right now. Right? We're in this capitalist system where people work for money. The big corporations pay people, workers, a certain amount of money, and the workers do all this work and they produce all this wealth, and the corporation takes all the excess wealth after it pays the workers. But Marx says this stage of history is actually going to self-destruct. Just like feudalism kind of self-destructed and the slave system of the Romans self-destructed, this system of history is going to self-destruct also, because capitalism, Marx says, is about competition. It's about competition. And so what you're constantly seeing is that two corporations will compete with each other, and eventually one of them is going to drive the other one out of business. And when that happens, you only have one corporation left. And so Marx says, and so it might, if you look at the automobile industry, when they first invented automobiles, you had dozens of corporations. You had REO, and you had Daimler-Benz, and you had Packard, and you had Studebaker, and you had all these different corporations producing cars. But gradually they get, the number of companies gets smaller and smaller, right? That General Motors becomes bigger and bigger, and then Packard and Studebaker, they have to bond together and make American Motors, and then American Motors goes under, it gets bought by Chrysler, and Chrysler gets bought by Fiat, and you get a smaller and smaller number of bigger and bigger car companies. That Marx says that's the normal operation of capitalism. That's what capitalism does, is you get competition until somebody goes out of business, and then you have fewer companies competing until another one goes out of business, and then you have even fewer companies competing. But Marx says what's happening then is the people who own General Motors are getting richer and richer. But there's less and less competition until eventually you're just going to have one car company or one internet browser company or what have you. You're going to get monopolies. And Marx says that's the natural endpoint of capitalism. But when you get a monopoly, what happens then is you have a small number of people who own this one company and are super rich. And then you have most people in society are working for really shitty wages, because the competition between companies, the companies kept driving down wages to save money. And so you get most of the population is going deeper and deeper into poverty, and a small number of people are getting richer and richer and richer. And when that happens, Marx says, capitalism is going to collapse. And so the fourth stage of history, capitalism, will eventually, in the future, collapse, and you will get the stage of history that Marx calls communism, where people will realize that the problem the whole time was private property. We need to get rid of private property, and we'll create a society where everybody owns everything, and you'll have equality again, and there won't be any of this haves and have-nots because there will be no private property. So Marx basically sees a five-stage vision of history. Primitive communism, which is hunter-gatherers, gives away, when you create private property, you get a slave society like ancient Rome, and then that collapses and you get a feudal society like the Middle Ages, and then that collapses and you get a capitalist society like we live in now, and this will eventually collapse and you'll get a communist society again, but this time people actually know what they're doing and they'll fully understand why they're choosing communism. All right, so that's Marx's stages of history. When he looks at history, when Marx looks at history, he's always saying, what's the economy and how is that shaping everything else in history? So he says the economy shapes everything else in history. Now, Marx has two phases. On the one hand, Marx is diagnosing capitalism today, right? Marx is actually considered one of the founding fathers of sociology because he studies how society operates, and he studies why things happen the way they are and how religion supports the power structure and where government comes from, etc. So Marx is, in one sense, just diagnosing existing societies. Now, Marx has another side, which is Marx the revolutionary. He's predicting a revolution in the future, and he wants the revolution to happen. Those are two different things, because Marx's diagnosis of society right now can be pretty good, even if his predictions for future revolution might be a little cuckoo, and they're not good predictions. So Marx has sort of two faces. There's the person who's diagnosing society right now, who's pretty sharp, and there's the person who's predicting a revolution who's a bit utopian and a bit vague about what's going to happen. So what are the takeaways from this? What do we want from Marx? Well, the key here is that Marx thinks that for any time in history, any change in history, if you want to understand why was it like that in history, the first thing you have to do is say, what are the social classes, what's the economy like, and what social classes does that produce? And Marx says for each social class, look at how they make their money, and that will tell you why they're acting the way they are. Because a factory worker working in a factory or a peasant working on a tiny farm, they have certain interests that are determined by their position in the economy. They're going to want certain things based on where they are in the economy. An aristocrat has other things that he wants. The aristocrat wants to protect his rights. The peasant wants to get rid of those rights, right? So society is always filled with conflict because different social classes are trying to change the system. They're always fighting with each other. It's sort of low-level fighting. It's not like actual violence fighting usually. It's low-level fighting, like aristocrats try to squeeze money out of peasants and peasants try to cheat the system. They're fighting over who gets what out of the system, who gets what out of the economy. But they're doing it in a sort of a low-level struggle that nobody really acknowledges, but it's there. And so in our society today, workers might go on strike demanding higher wages. That's part of class struggle, Marx argues. And then the factory owners might fire the people who are the leaders of the labor union. That's part of class struggle. And maybe the factory owners get a law passed by the government saying that labor unions are illegal. That's part of class struggle. And maybe the working class, maybe they stop going to the public education system because they think it's brainwashing them, and they set up their own homeschooling system. That's part class struggle. So Marx argues that if you want to understand any period of history, start with the economy, look at who makes what in the economy, how the economy runs, who owns what, who gets rich out of this, who's doing the work, what do they get out of it. And then you can say everything else in the economy is determined by everything else in the society is determined by the economy. So the religion is determined by the economy and the government is determined by the economy. And so if there's ever any change or conflict in society, look for class conflict. It's a struggle between groups of people over who gets what in the society. So for Marx, he tends to think of people not as individuals who are making their own choices, but rather as people who are shaped by their social class. The aristocrats are not really free to make any decision they want to. They've been shaped by being an aristocrat. They have certain interests they have to defend as aristocrats. They have to defend their position in society, so they don't really have free will to do whatever they want. They really are forced to defend their aristocratic position and take up ideas that defend that position. And the peasants, they're not free to do whatever they want. Their whole experience is shaped by being a peasant. They have a limited understanding of the world because they're peasants. They don't have great education or stuff like that, but they understand their own self-interest. And so they're going to act to try to destroy the system that's screwing them over. So Marx basically, when he looks at history, he sees people not as individuals making choices, but rather as members of a social class that are being sort of driven by this system to act in certain ways. Right? Either the system forces them to go along with the system and they do what they're supposed to, or their dire straits force them to act in certain ways to change the system. But either way, people are generally just acting as representatives of a social class. And so Marxist historians tend to not say, oh, Bob did this. They say the working class did this. Or, Jacques and Joseph didn't do that. The aristocracy did that. They tend to see each person as a member of a class, and they tend to see social classes as the actors in society. They're the ones who do things. So Marxists are really useful at pointing out that something like a religion might actually be the way it is because it's representing the interests of the haves. Or the education system might be there as a form of control to let the haves brainwash the lower classes to keep them in place. That's a really good insight, and it might help to figure out why the education system in a given society is like it is, or why the religion is what it is, etc., or why the government does what it does. But if Marxism has a shortcoming, it's that it doesn't really see individual people making decisions. It sees social classes. So it doesn't see this or that peasant, it just sees peasants. It doesn't see this or that person as an aristocrat, it sees aristocrats. And so it says that basically people don't have much free will, they don't have much choice, their actions are determined by where they are in the social system. In terms of the French Revolution then, when historians look at the French Revolution, and Marx, developed his theory in part to explain why the French Revolution happened. But basically, Marxists then assumed that the French Revolution was class conflict. The French Revolution was a conflict between different social classes. And in particular, what the Marxists assume is that you had this system that had aristocrats and peasants, and it was set up to make the peasants do all the work on the land and generate agricultural produce, and then the aristocrats would take a portion of that, and that made the aristocrats rich and powerful, and the aristocrats controlled the government, they controlled the religion, they controlled the education system, they controlled all of that, all the laws and all that, to keep everything in place. But, Marx says, you started to see this new class appear, this class he calls the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie was a new sort of class because it didn't make its money by either working on the farm or owning the farm. The bourgeoisie made its money by buying and selling things. And so Marx argues that what's happening is that the bourgeoisie in the French Revolution they don't like the system. And they're rising up to overthrow the aristocratic system. And the peasants join them because the peasants don't like the aristocratic system either. But really the French Revolution is the revolution of the bourgeoisie. Okay? So Marxist historians basically explain the French Revolution as a class conflict. You have a system where the aristocracy owns all the farmland and exploits all the peasants, but this system has created this little side thing in the cities with trade and stuff, and the people who run the trade, the bourgeoisie, they're not happy with the system. They have no voice in government because the aristocrats control the government. They have no voice in the church because the aristocrats control the church, and they don't like it. And so what the bourgeoisie does is it rises up to overthrow the government, and it uses the peasants and working class people in the cities as sort of the foot soldiers to overthrow the aristocracy and change the system. But then, the Marxists argue, the bourgeoisie takes control and they make themselves a new set of haves. They install a capitalist system and they still exploit, they turn the peasants into factory workers, but they still exploit them. So essentially, what the French Revolution is this moment where you're going from a feudal society with aristocrats and peasants, and all the wealth comes from agriculture, to an industrial society where you have the bourgeois factory owners exploiting working class factory workers. And so the French Revolution is the moment where the bourgeoisie rises up and overthrows the aristocracy. And all the things happening in the French Revolution are basically this struggle between the middle class, the bourgeoisie, and the aristocracy, with the support of the peasants and the workers, the urban workers, mostly supporting the bourgeoisie, but not necessarily, because each group has their own interests based on their economic position. So when you're looking at history from Marxist eyes, you're constantly going to be saying, who are the social classes we're talking about here? If this person's going to do something, what social class do they represent? Louis XVI is not representing himself, he's representing the aristocracy. Right? The Marquis de Lafayette is not representing himself, he's representing the aristocracy. Or, etc. And so you tend to think of conflict like the French Revolution not as individual people making decisions, but as social classes made up of people fighting each other. Right? We'll go into this more later. Basically, for our purposes, I'm going to have you be reading Lefebvre. One of the handouts is Lefebvre, and we're going to be talking about how Lefebvre sees the French Revolution. And when you're reading Lefebvre, I want you to really think about how does he see social class conflict appearing in the French Revolution. When he talks about people, he tends to use terms like the bourgeoisie a lot. He doesn't talk about individual people, he talks about the bourgeoisie doing this or the aristocracy doing that. Right? That's because he sees social conflict as class conflict. It's all about the economic conflict. All right. Stop for a second then. That's Marxism. Okay, that's one theory of how history works. It's all about class conflict. It's all about the economy, etc. Now we're going to move to a different system, which is called post-structuralism. And I'm not going to go into why they call it post-structuralism. But essentially, post-structuralism is a loose term. It's not very precise. But it includes a whole bunch of approaches to history that generally focus on language and culture. Okay. Now, Marx said over here that the economy shapes everything. Everything else is determined by the economy. Post-structuralists say, no, we don't think that's true. Post-structuralists actually think that language and culture are independent. They're on their own sort of trajectory. They change in their own ways, on their own logic, etc. But the most important thing for post-structuralists is that human beings don't think in a vacuum. Human beings think using language. And post-structuralists argue that language shapes your thought patterns. If you grow up speaking English, your thought patterns are different, post-structuralists say, than if you grow up speaking Japanese. And in particular, culture, all the ideas about gender and race and how you're supposed to behave and what government's for and what religion's for and all that are in fact built on language. And so language shapes how you think about things. And a way to think about this is you could think about the ways that, as you go through life, your eyes pick up all sorts of colors, right? But language divides those colors up into specific categories: red, green, blue, etc. Right? But suppose one language has a different set of categories than another language. In fact, we know that in fact, in the course of linguistic development, it seems like initially you only have colors for red, yellow, and blue, but then later green emerges to differentiate between blue and yellow, right? But initially, things that we would call green would just be called blue or yellow. Well, in that sense, having the word green means that in your mind you've got a category now of green things. That if you only have blue and yellow, you shove all the green things into either blue or yellow. You don't have anything green in your mind. So having the word green creates a category, and now your mind is sorting the real world into those categories, right? Now there are blue things, and there are yellow things, and there are green things, right? Whereas before there weren't. And suppose you work for a paint company, and now green things can become sage and olive and forest and leaf, green, or sea green, or whatever, Your mind has all these different categories. This allows you to think differently about color, right? And post-structuralists will argue that this happens in all sorts of ways, right? That, for instance, they would say if you're thinking about social class, it depends on what kind of words you have for social class. If you have upper class and lower class are the only words you have, you're going to think in one way. But if you have aristocracy, bourgeoisie, proletariat, and peasantry, you're going to think differently. You have different categories, right? And so as you go through life, you're going to sort people in different categories. Think about race. Post-structuralists would argue that race is just simply a spectrum. People have all sorts of different physical features. They have all sorts of different skin colors. They have all sorts of different hair types, eye shapes, etc. And as you go through life, you could just see a person and say, oh, well, they're there on the spectrum, right? But in our culture, we have categories for race. We have Asian, we have Latino, we have African American, and we have Native American, and we have Caucasian, etc. And that sorts us into different categories. And we don't have to have those categories. We could have 27 different categories, right? But because we have these 5 categories, when we go through life, we sort people we shove these people into that person's African American, that person's Caucasian. And even if there are 2 people who look almost identical, we might say that one's African American, that one's Caucasian. It creates a separation in our minds, right? Because the words are there, we have the categories, and we start shoving reality into those categories. Or to put it slightly differently, we experience reality through the categories we have in our heads, through the language categories we have in our heads. Right? So, we experience 4-legged animals in all sorts of different ways, as cows, dogs, cats, right? Or think of dogs, we experience dogs as poodles or collies or Labrador retrievers or chihuahuas. But in fact, dogs are a huge spectrum, and we don't have to divide them that way. We could divide them up different ways. So post-structuralists argue that language gives us categories, and we actually interpret reality through those categories. Okay. Now, language does more than that, though, because language also has what we would call power relationships in it, right? Language has connotations. It has meaning in it. And so we don't just say this race and that race are different. language has power relations in it, because there are lots of words for race. If you ever wondered why some words for race are really nasty, you don't say the N word, but you can say African American. Or think about the connotations of the word Negro or colored, which are words we used in the past. Those all have different meanings, right? They imply different power relationships. If you call someone African American, you're saying, yes, that's their race, but I'm not saying they're below me or anything. But if you call them the N-word, you're saying, you're insulting them and you're putting them below you in a power structure. And so using the N-word is a form of asserting power. You belong down there because I called you the N-word, not African American, which puts you equal with me, right? And if you use the word Negro or colored, it has different connotations, right? So language has meaning. It implies power structures. It implies a way you're supposed to understand what's going on here. If somebody uses the N-word, you understand the conversation totally differently than if they use the word African American, right? So it gives meaning to things. It doesn't just give you categories, but it gives meaning to those categories. Post-structuralists talk about something called discourses. They say that there are certain chunks of language that sort of hold together and have their own vocabulary, and they have their own sort of internal dynamics. You might think of medicine as a discourse, right? In common terms, you might say, I was puking and I had the runs, but in medical discourse, you're going to say they were vomiting and had diarrhea. Doctors will talk about the morbidity and mortality rates of a disease rather than how many people died or, et cetera. And these sorts of terminology differences, you might say, well, that doesn't really matter, mortality and death rate are the same thing. Except that when people talk in terms of morbidity and mortality, when they use technical terms for, hemorrhaging instead of just bleeding or et cetera, what they're doing is they're creating a power discourse. They're saying, I am using the correct scientific terminology. I have an understanding of this topic that you don't unless you understand the terminology too. So the terminology becomes a way of saying, I'm an expert here and you're not, unless you can use the terminology too. So if we can both use this terminology, we recognize each other as knowledgeable, but if you don't use that terminology, you don't know what you're talking about, right? And so discourses can set up power structures. And you can think about it this way. In medicine, if a doctor could walk into the room and he could say, here's my next door neighbor, that implies somebody you're going to talk to as a friend, as an equal, right? But if the doctor walks into the room and says, here's the patient, that implies the doctor is the one doing the examination and the patient is the one being examined. The patient is passive. The doctor is the one in charge here. The doctor is the one who's doing things. So that word patient implies a power relationship, and it sets up a way of behaving. Right? And so discourses are not just a collection of specialized words like medical terminology or medical jargon. They're also a set of power relationships and a set of behaviors. So culture, and this is where language shapes culture. Language and culture, they give us little scripts for how we're supposed to behave. If you're a patient, you're supposed to behave one way. If you're a doctor, you're supposed to behave a different way. Right? If you're a lawyer, you're supposed to behave one way. If you're a defendant in court, you're supposed to behave a different way. And there's all sorts of legal terminology in the law field to make sure that lawyers are the ones who have the power because they understand the terminology, and the defendants and the witnesses don't understand the terminology and they don't have the power, right? And every field has this sort of language and terminology and these power structures built into it. It's built into the language that you use, right? And so what post-structuralists, when they look at history, they say, well, people don't just behave the way they want to behave. People are constantly thinking with language, and they're using the ideas that their culture gives them to try to make sense of the world, right? They're trying to know how they're supposed to act by using the culture as guidelines for how they're supposed to act. They're trying to make sense of who's in charge and who has power and who doesn't based on the language and the culture, right? And here's where it gets interesting, because when they look at the French Revolution, what post-structuralists will say is the culture broke down. That basically the culture started to break down and change, and when that happened, there was a sudden crisis in meaning. If everybody agrees that the old way of understanding the world isn't working anymore, we need a new way of understanding the world. But now you get disagreement about what's the new way we're supposed to do it, right? Before, everyone could agree this is the way we all understand the world, this is the language we use, this is the power relationships we have. But if that breaks down, we don't know how to act anymore. We don't know how to think about things, right? So we need to build up a new language, a new discourse that will help us understand what's going on. But, and this is the key, nobody agrees at first on what those discourses should mean. And so different groups start to propose different discourses and different ideas, and you get a fight about language and categories and meaning. And so the post-structuralists, when they look at the French Revolution, they don't say, this was an economic conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. They say the French government collapsed, and everyone agreed that they're not going to think about the government and the king and power and sovereignty the same way anymore, but nobody could agree on how they were supposed to think about it going forward, and that led to conflict because different groups understood government and different ways. Okay. And in particular, before the French Revolution, the sort of standard discourse of the government was that God had ordained the king to be king, he had the divine right of kings, and that the king had all power. All power of the government was in the king himself, and he could give that power to other people by saying, you're going to be the intendant of this area, or you're going to be the judge on this court, or whatever. But all power came from the king. And the king inherited that power from his father when his father died. And God guaranteed all this. And the church guaranteed all this. And so there are all sorts of rituals about the king and his power and his body that you had to respect. But when the French Revolution happens, they all agree, well, that system isn't going to work anymore. But what replaces it? How do we think about government power but now? Where does government power come from? Who has it? How do we know somebody has the power of the government behind them? How do we know somebody has the power to exercise some authority? How do we recognize who's supposed to be in charge? Right? That's a crisis of meaning. It's a crisis of language. How do we talk about the government if we don't want to have a king at the center of it? How do we talk about sovereignty and power and law? Right? And so the French Revolution then is a crisis of meaning. It's a crisis of language. And when post-structuralists want to look at the French Revolution, what they look at is, let's look at the language people are using. Right? Because we can trace the conflict between this body of ideas, this discourse about government, and this discourse about government. We can see that the people who are fighting each other are disagreeing about these fundamental ideas, these fundamental terms, and the language shows us what the lines of that disagreement are. The language can show us how this fight is playing out, and the language can help us understand it. So basically, Marxist historians are going to say the French Revolution is a class conflict. Every time you're looking at any event in the French Revolution, look at what social class everybody is from, and then you can see how it's a class conflict, and everybody's behaviors were determined by their position in the class structure. So peasants are going to act one way, urban working poor are going to act one way, the bourgeoisie is going to act one way, aristocrats are going to act one way, and they all represent the interests of their class. So Marxists say it's all about the economy, it's all about class conflict, people are determined in their behavior by class. Post-structuralists say, no. People are not determined. They can pick different ideas are floating around in society. They can pick whatever ideas they like. But when you pick ideas, they belong to a discourse, and that brings in other ideas, and it brings in a certain logic and way of thinking about things. And the French Revolution is this moment where nobody agrees on what's the right way to think about things, and so they argue about these ideas, and it becomes a deadly conflict because people can't convince, if one person has one set of ideas and another person has another set of ideas, they can't even agree on how they're going to talk about it because they don't have the same words for it. So ultimately what you wind up with is a form of violence until they can somebody can impose their meaning on it and say, this is how we're thinking about it. So basically, we're going to be looking at these two theories. This one is represented by Lefebvre in the Lefebvre reading, and there's a little bit of this in Brinton, in the Brinton reading. This one is represented by Furet and Baker in particular. So we're going to be reading the Furet and Baker pieces. These are the post-structuralists. So keep that in mind, that when you're reading Lefebvre, he's a Marxist, he's going to be talking about class. Look at the ways he uses class. When you're reading Baker or Furet, they're talking about language. Look at the ways they use ideas of language. So that's it for this lecture.